Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you like this episode, please remember to hit the like button and leave a comment or two, then subscribe and click on the bell to receive notifications of whenever we release new videos. Also, please remember to share them to your social media. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the wind-blown ruggedness of Admiralty Island off the coast of Alaska. On the south end of the island is Pybus Bay, which is fairly large and open. On the north end of the bay is a small peninsula-like jut of land that pokes out a bit. At this point in the bay, the beach is tangled with fallen trees and stumps, making navigation and vision very difficult. The beach gives way to dense groves of spruce and fir, with alder, willow, and devil's club, obscuring any hope anyone would have vision past a few yards. It is in this dangerous and wild setting that our episode today takes place. On the morning of Monday, April 26, 2004, 39-year-old Scott Newman had led a bear hunting client of his for the past 9 days on a so far fruitless brown bear hunt. His client was a textile manufacturer from Mexico City, whom we will refer to as Juan. With Juan's wife and Scott's nephew, Levi Newman, acting as assistant guide and cook, the hunting trip took on a family-friendly quality to it. Scott was an avid outdoorsman and had been guiding hunts for 17 years. A little over 12 years ago, he started up his own guiding operation and was now doing it for his own business. Field and Stream magazine reported him as a superb guide, and many of his clients agree. For the prior 9 days, the hunters would get up early and wolf down breakfast and coffee and either hit a trail to a nearby ridge or hop in the skiff to look for bears along the edges of the bay. Each day they would glass the hillside from any vantage point they could find, but just weren't seeing a lot of bears. In fact, they had only seen 9 bears to this point, and were becoming a little frustrated with the lack of cooperation they were getting from the bears. They are supposed to be out looking for food to break their winter fast of hibernation, but they were just not there. After passing on a decent bear on the 5th day of the hunt, their prospects were looking bleak. On the 10th and final day of the hunt, they spotted a good brown bear boar toward the middle of the bay on a little peninsula that pokes out a bit. Scott knew that this was the last best chance they would have at bagging a bear, even if it wasn't the giant bruiser they were looking for. He piloted the boat downwind several hundred yards and quietly anchored their skiff and disembarked. Scott decided they would make the final approach on foot, which would give them a better chance to look the bear over and place a shot that would humanely conclude the hunt. As the hunters closed in on the bear, they could see him doing something behind a group of deadfall logs on the beach. They would see his massive head pop up and down, and then one of his legs would poke out of the tangle. Then it would look as if it was moving off a bit, and then it would start all over again. It is possible that the bear was digging for razor clams, which are a large-sized clam species that buries itself on the sandy shores along the sea in the area. Bears love them and spend as much time as needed to dig them out and devour them. Each one goes on average at about 0.63 ounces of meat, which is rich in nutrients and fat, so it is a good food source for bears. Scott kept an eye on the bear as the men navigated the deadfall trees littering the shore. They would have to crawl under some or over others, all while making sure the wind stayed in their favor as they approached the bear. The hunters managed to stalk within 140 yards of the bear before running out of cover. They had no other means to get closer to him and remain hidden, so Scott had Juan set up to shoot on a log, and they began waiting for a good shot on the bear. The fickle winds on the island concerned Scott a bit. He knew they might change at any moment, so after a little while, he decided to try something new. In the tangle of stumps and tree trunks, the bear still managed to stay obscured as the hunters approached. Scott decided a better angle was in order and began crawling on his belly toward the edge of the shoreline. He was hoping to see the bear's position, but what the bear did next would put the entire hunting party at risk. As Scott belly crawled while holding his rifle and binoculars, he glanced back toward Juan and noticed he had his rifle down and wasn't ready to shoot. The bear decided he should investigate this new scent that had swirled into his nostrils as the wind shifted slightly. The boar-brown bear leapt upon the crisscrossed log jam and stared toward the hunters. Juan was so excited by seeing the bear at such close range and presenting such a large portion of his body as a target that he drew down on the bear while it was facing directly toward him. Now, whenever you hunt, your goal should always be a broadside shot. This allows the greatest opportunity for your projectile, whether bullet, arrow, or spear, to slice through as many vital organs as possible. The likelihood of your projectile striking both lungs while the animal is broadside are much higher than if you fire at them while they face you directly. In addition, the likelihood of a bullet breaking down any portion of the bear's shoulders or hips in a front-facing shot are very small, meaning they can still come after you, even if they are mortally wounded. As the bear popped up on top of one of the logs, Juan fired a bullet and hit center mass. The shot he fired was a fatal shot in about 20 minutes, but 20 minutes of time spent with an irate brown bear might be your last 20 minutes of life. Juan fired a total of 3 shots before Scott could tell him to wait until the bear was broadside. When he heard Juan's rifle fire through its entire load, Scott fired a few rounds from his .416 caliber Remington Magnum hunting rifle with its 400 grain bullets. The men watched as the massive bear streaked across the beach and into the nearby brush and disappeared. Just for the record, a .416 is bigger than that kiddie shotgun your grandpa showed you how to shoot sparrows with, the .410. It has a massive bullet which travels at 2,400 feet per second and delivers 5,100 pounds per square inch. Scientists say that brown bear bone is 10 times as dense as human bone, and to keep them from getting to you when you tick one off, you better make sure a few of those important brown bear bones don't work anymore. None of Juan's bullets struck a large bone. After the shooting stopped, Juan and Scott discussed their next steps. Scott's mind was filled with an upcoming hunt in a few days, and this hunt took longer than he had hoped. Since it was the final day of Juan's hunt, Scott thought it best to immediately trail the wounded bear, for no better reason that it was walking off with more lead in its body right now than most men could carry in a backpack. It was now 7 p.m., and darkness would be closing in less than 2 hours. The thought of coming back in the morning to resume tracking the bear, skinning it, and packing the hide out had occurred to Scott. The other option was to check on the blood trail that the bear had left and see if he could get a good sense of how fatal its injuries were. Scott opted for the latter of the 2 options, and the hunters cautiously approached the last point they saw the bear. They could see where the bear's tracks were and where the blood trail started. It was a good blood trail, with a wide path meaning the bear was bleeding from both sides of his body. This was a good sign to Scott, as he knew the bear couldn't possibly keep bleeding like this for very long before it bled out. As they tracked the blood trail, they found a long strip of bear scat alongside the blood and tracks. This is an indication that the bear is in distress, and it is emptying its bowels in a desperate attempt at escape. Scott estimated the bear had taken around 6 bullets fired from both rifles. There was no way this bear could absorb that much punishment and damage and live for very long. Scott followed the blood trail into the brush, alertly circling for a different perspective as he followed. As the blood trail continued, Scott began to grow a bit concerned. The blood trail was ample in amount, but was dark, which means that it is coming from somewhere closer to the gut area, as opposed to the lungs. Blood from the lungs is usually brighter in color and can be frothy in appearance. Scott knew that this was a bad sign and that the bear was likely still alive and very angry. As Scott reviewed the track evidence in front of him, he kept a careful eye on the direction of travel of the tracks, watching for a telltale circle trend in the tracks which can indicate an ambush. Just as he looked back down toward the ground, he caught a faint whiff of bear scent. He heard an ominous twig snap and quickly slipped his safety off on his rifle. As soon as the bear heard the click of Scott's safety, the ground shook with a roar so loud that it could disorient people. He glanced up and saw the bushes whipping and snapping as the bear mowed its way through and toward Scott. Just as the bear emerged from the brush, Scott could see the bear's right paw pulled back and ready to strike. He shouldered his rifle and leaned in to absorb its jolting kick and squeezed the trigger. Scott could see the fur on the bear's chest part from the impact of the bullet. The shot was fired from only 10 feet away, as the bear was facing him straight on and didn't have any significant effect on its advance. Scott quickly worked his bolt action and did what he called short-stroked the action of his rifle. What likely happened was he was in such a hurry to reload another shell that the prior shell didn't eject fully, ramming the new unspent shell into the backside of the spent cartridge. Scott feverishly worked to dislodge the spent shell from his rifle, but the bear was upon him before he could clear the jam. The enraged boar plowed into Scott going full speed, knocking him clean off his feet and onto his back. Scott knew he had to fight back and began kicking the bear repeatedly in the head. He knew he couldn't allow this bear to get a hold of his neck or head, or his life would be over quicker than the bear could toss his head. The bear clamped its jaws onto Scott's left foot, driving his shattered foot bones through the skin. Searing pain forced an eruption of profanity from Scott's mouth that would make a sailor blush. The bear pulled his head back and removed Scott's left boot in the process. Scott shoved the butt of his rifle into the bear's mouth, and it bit down hard. He held his hands to push the bear away, but the snapping jaws of the bear quickly crunched through them. Next, it worked its way up his left leg a few inches, crunching bones and tearing tissues the entire time. Scott was still trying to work the action of his rifle, hoping that he could shoot the bear before it was able to do fatal damage to him. Scott knew that damage to his lower legs would be painful, but probably not fatal. That is when the bear focuses its jaws on his left thigh muscle. It bit and tore his thigh muscle, rending huge chunks of tissue and flesh away with each bite. The enraged and wounded bear picked Scott up by his thigh muscle and flipped him upside down while shaking him back and forth. The warm blood gushed from his thigh wounds and ran down his skin inside of his pants. Then the bear dropped him and backed off a few steps. Scott could tell that the bear had begun to feel the deadly effects of the bullets. The attack was only about 30 seconds from when Scott fired the shot from 10 feet away from the bear until it turned away from him. In those 30 seconds, the bear had torn Scott's body up severely and unimaginably. The bear stood just 3 feet from Scott, glaring at him. He tried to close the bolt on his rifle, but could see the firing pin was stuck, preventing him from putting the bear down. Somehow, he still managed to get away. Each time he stepped on his left foot, it would fold up on him, so he hopped along on his left heel until he was a safe distance. Scott sat down and began yelling for help. He then pulled out his handheld radio and reached out to the Coast Guard, telling them he needed a medical helicopter now. He hadn't assessed his thigh wound very much yet, but was concerned that his femoral artery had been damaged or torn and he may bleed to death quickly. It was only a few minutes before Levi and a worker at a nearby lodge were at his side. He was a bloody mess, and it seemed like his blood was leaking from every pore in his body. Scott remained calm and never lost consciousness, while Levi and the worker stabilized him as they waited for the Coast Guard helicopter, which arrived about 90 minutes after the attack. The medical helicopter flew Scott out to the Sitka Community Hospital in Sitka, Alaska. He spent 23 days there and another 60 days recovering from home in Petersburg. The brown bear had left Scott with 32 puncture wounds over his hands, one arm, his left leg, and foot. The following day, Levi and another guide brought Juan back to recover the bear. As they rolled the bear over to skin him, they could see that the bear had died while laying on top of Scott's boot. After reviewing the riveting and chilling facts surrounding this episode, I am left with a few questions. Do you think that this attack could have been avoided with bear spray? Do you think Scott should have left Juan on the beach or brought into the timber as a backup shooter? Do you think it is a good idea to follow a wounded brown bear into a dense patch of timber and brush? Do you think this episode has an eerie similarity to the episode we did on the bow hunter Ronnie Lemming? I will enjoy reading your posts, so please comment in the comment section below, and let's talk about it.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks.
Today's episode takes us to a location just a few hundred miles south of our prior episode on Christine Courtney, about 55 miles west of Calgary, Alberta, Canada, to a frequently traveled trail near Canmore. This area is lush pine and fir forests rimmed with giant granite mountain peaks. The mountains in this area run north and south and form a high elevation barrier that draws precipitation to it. The mountaintops are cold enough to cause the clouds to condense enough to release their moisture in the form of rain and snow, which benefits the forest and animals alike. The common animals you will see here are moose, elk, deer, caribou, sheep, and mountain goats. The predators of the area include coyotes, wolves, cougars, as well as black and brown bears. It is in this picturesque and scenic setting that our episode takes place today. Canmore is a small resort-like town with only 13,000 inhabitants. It has a nice golf course called Silvertip with a nice jogging trail around it. It seems like lately there have been a lot of brown bears interacting with people here, and some of those interactions are not very settling. There was a smallish male brown bear who had been frequenting and even stalking people while they were outdoors with their pets or just out for a walk. On a sunny afternoon in early May of 2005, Nikki Davison took her basset hound out for a walk and was planning on taking pictures of some wild flowers near Silvertip Golf Course. Silvertip is named after the hair color grizzlies are known for that makes them appear grizzled. While she had her photo shoot set up, a loud crash came from the trees just above where her and her dog were. They had unwittingly drawn the attention of the previously mentioned young brown bear. As the bear crept down onto the hiking trail, Nikki's mind was filled with terrifying thoughts of nightmares realized. The bear slowly and methodically walked toward Nikki and her dog as she quickly picked up her equipment. Nikki led her dog in a slow retreat from the bear for 10 minutes along the golf course trail. This brown bear was stalking Nikki and her dog. Its head was low and it stared at them as it slowly approached them. She managed to escape the hair-raising encounter and immediately reported the incident to wildlife officials. Wildlife officials showed up and tranquilized the young brown bear. They next affixed a radio tracking collar and relocated the bear to an area inside of nearby Banff National Park, hoping that he would find a niche for himself among local bear populations and forget his fascination with human civilization. For the next week, the bear researchers had watched him as his monitor indicated he was making his way back toward the golf course and what he must have considered his home. He seemed to hang out for a few days in the hills just above town, before making his way back to the Silvertip Golf Course area and the site of the tragedy of our topic today. A female hiker was enjoying her time on the trail on June 5, 2005. She was near the first hole of the Silvertip Golf Course when she was confronted by the same young bear who was relocated. He exhibited the same stalking behaviors and she began to yell in an attempt to frighten him. Her screams alerted a groundskeeper on the golf course. He drove the golf course pickup truck over to the hiker and picked her and her dog up and drove them to safety. Next, he flipped on the golf course irrigation system and doused the bear to encourage him to leave. A little understanding of recent policies is in order. There is an international policy called the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative, which works to codify into environmental policies protected travel corridors, which are supposed to allow wildlife to travel between habitats. The idea behind this is that as wildlife becomes stressed, they might relieve that stress by utilizing a wildlife travel corridor to access a different habitat in which the demands on them may differ. Canmore is just one of many U.S. and Canadian towns located in the middle of the Yellowstone to Yukon corridor. This policy is in conflict with allowing burgeoning towns the development that they are inevitably experiencing. The trail near the Silvertip Golf Course had been closed since April to allow wildlife like cougars and bears to cross into adjacent habitats free of human interference. After frightening the hiker, the young brown bear dashed off into the nearby forest, only to return once things calmed down. Along this same portion of the trail, a small group of friends were jogging. In that group was 36-year-old competitive mountain biker Isabelle Dube. She was the mother of a 5-year-old daughter and an avid fitness practitioner. She worked as a substitute French language teacher after relocating to Canmore from a small town near Quebec City. Isabelle and two of her female jogging partners rounded a bend in the trail, coming face to face with one of their darkest fears. There was the young brown bear standing and facing them in the trail, a mere 20 meters ahead of them. The bear was staring directly at them, with its head low and ears pinned back. As it stared at them, it slowly lumbered toward them with an eerie quietness. It was apparent this bear was interested in approaching the women with clear intentions. The group of joggers slowly backed up as one. They gave ground to the young brown bear as it closed in on them slowly. The women fought the urge to break and run away, knowing this may cause a predatory response from the bear. They made noise, yelled, and slowly gave ground for a considerable distance before realizing this bear was intent on eating them. Isabel decided she would seek the protection of a tree, so as the ladies gave ground, she started climbing up into its boughs, hoping that the bear wouldn't be able to climb it. The problem is that most brown bears are too big to climb trees very well, but smaller ones can climb trees as well as black bears. As Isabel grabbed limbs and pulled herself up, higher and higher into the tree, her jogging partners continued to back down the trail and around the bend. As soon as the joggers lost sight of the bear, they broke and ran the 1/4 mile distance to find an attendee at the Silvertip golf course. The last they saw of Isabel was that she was climbing into the tree and the bear was focused on her as she did so. They knew they had only a limited amount of time and had to hope for the best for Isabel as they got help. It doesn't take joggers much time to sprint a 1/4 mile or so. As they ran, they could hear Isabel screaming at the bear. The joggers probably covered the distance in about a minute. Locating someone to help and relaying the information surrounding Isabel's situation may have taken another minute or so, and responding to the location took at least a few more minutes. This established a very short timeline of at least 3 to 5 minutes, in which the bear somehow climbed the tree Isabel was sheltering in. It had somehow pulled her out of the tree she was in to the ground below. In that short amount of time, this undersized young brown bear had mauled Isabel Dube to death before rescuers arrived. One of Isabel's jogging partners guided an armed Fish and Wildlife officer back to the attack scene. The officer shot and killed the young brown bear with a single bullet as it defended Isabel's body, clearly claiming it as a food source. A post-mortem analysis on the bear revealed it to be a 4-year-old male weighing in at just under 200 pounds. This is very small for a 4-year-old male brown bear. Isabel was the first human fatality from bear attack in the province of Alberta since 1998. Isabel's husband, Heath McCroy, and her 5-year-old daughter, Leah, now had to put their lives back together after burying their beloved wife and mother. If this story ended there, it would be tragic and sad enough, but there is a second part to this story. When her mother died in this bear attack, Leah was 5 years old and already remarkable like her mother. She embraced the same lifestyle centered around fitness and enjoyed running on the Canmore trails. Her father and her established guidelines for trail running. These guidelines included always carrying bear spray and never running alone. Near Canmore, there had been another bear controversy brewing. Bear number 148 had a tag in her ear, meaning at some point she had been tranquilized, tattooed on her lip, and tracked after being captured near Canmore. This is typically done when the bear is involved in a human-centered problem, which could be as minor as getting into a trash bin at night, or as serious as behaving aggressively toward people on trail systems. Now, most grizzly females don't give birth until they are about 5 to 6 years old, and then only have cubs on an average cycle of every 4 years. Bear number 148 was 6.5 years old and had no cubs. Given their lifespan averages about 25 years, this means she will only have about 4 litters of up to 4 cubs in her lifetime. Half of these cubs will die before their first year, so you can see just how precarious their long-term population can be. Leah had decided to go for a jog on the trail systems near Canmore, and this time she made a deviation to the guidelines her and her father had established and practiced for years. She was planning on going jogging by herself today and forgot her bear spray in her car, parked at the lot of the trailhead. As Leah, now 17 years old, jogged down the trail, her mind slipped into that mode that runners use to unfocus their attention. She bounced along the trail for several hundred yards before there was a very frightening crashing sound just off the trail. She rounded a portion of the trail and stood within just a few yards of a very angry bear, number 148. The bear was huffing and popping her jaws at Leah. There was nearly no room between Leah and the angry sow. Right then, rapid thoughts flashed through Leah's mind. She was terrified and immediately thought she would suffer the same fate as her mother. Her and her father had discussed how to be bear-aware, how to back slowly away from a confrontation to bring bear spray and to not look like prey to a predator. Leah's mind went blank when she was face to face with the bear. Not only did she not bring her bear spray, she broke the primary rule when confronted by a bear. She ran away. She states that she recalls thinking how she was not dying today as she bolted from the bear. As she sailed along the trail back toward her parked car and the safety it offered, her mind flashed with fears and thoughts. She considered that this is how her mother felt in her last moments. The fear and terror had to be the same. The contrast in the mother's response and Leah's was glaring to her. Her mother stood her ground and did everything right, but still lost her life. Leah did everything wrong and fled a predator that could easily catch her, but managed to survive without a scratch. After safely returning to her car, Leah reported the incident to Fish and Wildlife officers. Bear number 148 was relocated to Jasper National Park just a few hours north following this incident. She had a tracking collar placed on her so that researchers could monitor her, and she is staying put in her new area. She seems to be fitting in well, very near where she was released. Leah explains that she wants bears to be protected and not be threatened by people. She admits there are territorial bears, and she hopes Bear 148 does well in her new home. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I have a few questions for you. Do you think it is eerie that Isabel and Leah both had close-range confrontations with brown bears on the same trail system doing the same thing? Do you think that if Isabel and her jogging partners had run away, that they would have all survived? Do you think that bear spray may have saved Isabel's life? Are local governments better off hazing bears away from municipalities to prevent conflicts between bears and humans? I look forward to reading your responses, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks.
Today's episode takes us to familiar territory, near Cluane Park, a few hours by car west of Whitehorse, Yukon Territory, Canada. This area borders Alaska and shares the St. Elias Mountains with it. There are about 45,000 visitors who have visited the park each year of its 24-year history at the time of this incident. The park is riddled with glaciers and high rocky mountains. In fact, the highest mountain in Canada, Mount Logan, is here soaring 19,551 feet high above the Beauty. The forests here are comprised of white spruce, balsam poplar, and quaking aspen. Along rivers, streams, and lakes, willow and alder shelter the animals and birds. Common animals here include Yukon wolves, Yukon moose, caribou, lynx, and wolverines. There are also black and brown bears stalking the forests as well. This is the picturesque and wild setting in which our episode takes place. At the Cluane Park office is a brochure that discusses what to do if you are attacked by a bear while enjoying the park. It instructs visitors to play dead by curling up in a ball covering their face, neck, and abdomen. The brochure is titled, "You Are in Bear Country." What the brochure doesn't say is the proper context in which this advice is helpful. On Friday, July 5, 1996, newlyweds Christine Courtney and her husband Paul were enjoying a hike on the Slims Valley Trail. They had just been married a little less than a year prior and were enjoying touring the national parks together. The two lovebirds had traveled up from New Westminster, British Columbia, where Paul was a customs broker by profession. The Kearneys wore bear bells to make sure the bear knew they were there. They had run into a few bears in their travels, and they augmented their direct learning by reading about bears. They were bear-aware, as the saying goes. They didn't pack foods that emanated tempting scents, nor were they wearing perfume or colognes. They packed out what they packed in and avoided close confrontations with bears whenever they encountered them. They knew better than to run away and stimulate the predatory response from a bear. The Courtneys didn't bring bear spray, nor did they bring a large knife with them. Visitors to Canada's national parks and historical monuments are prohibited from carrying firearms. They were about 3 miles into their hike and enjoying their time together, surrounded by scenery that would make Claude Monet jealous. He couldn't paint a landscape as breathtaking and beautiful as what they were hiking through. With their packs across their backs, they noticed down the trail about 50 yards or so, a rather smallish brown bear heading directly toward them. It looked to be about the size of a St. Bernard dog and had its head low, as if it was smelling a scent trail. It seemed oblivious to the hikers, so they decided to give it a wide berth and left the trail by about 35 yards or so. That is when the bear obviously noticed them, and it left the trail in a direct line toward them. The Courtneys decided to shed their backpacks as a distraction and move off a little farther. Their food was properly stored in the bear-proof containers, so the bear didn't smell anything interesting there, and wandered right past the backpacks toward the hikers. The Courtneys were now growing very uneasy as this bear took far too much interest in them to be comfortable. They continued back up and entered a clearing, hoping that seeing the people in the open would bring the bear to its senses, and it would recognize them as not its typical food. As the bear continued to approach them, they decided to follow the advice on the brochure back at the park office. They sat down and curled into a ball, protecting their faces, necks, and stomachs. The playing dead routine was in full effect by the time the bear ambled up to the couple. The brown bear initially sniffed at Paul, but then began to be uncomfortably interested in Christine. It sniffed her over very thoroughly and immediately began to paw and bite her. Once the bear began to bite Christine, she couldn't help but react. She screamed out in terror and pain. This caused Paul to come to her defense. Paul picked up a stick and beat the bear about the head. He then began to punch the bear and try to drive it off his wife. He repeatedly struck the bear, but it simply turned toward him and raked him with its claws. It then bit him on the leg. Paul was unsure what to do next and ran a short distance to hide behind a tree. As soon as it had run Paul off, it redirected its attention back to Christine. Paul was justifiably scared, but seeing his wife being attacked, immediately returned to punch and kick the bear again. With every punch he threw, the bear's intentions did not waver. It never took its focus off of its attack on Christine. Christine managed to tell Paul that his efforts to save her were doing no good, as the bear had its mind set. Realizing the danger and futility of the situation, Paul knew he would need help. He decided to run to the Sheep Mountain Visitor Center back at the head of the trail. He ran the first 4 miles, and a car drove him the last 2 miles. He alerted the authorities of his wife's plight, and an armed rescue helicopter was in the air within minutes and headed to the location. As the copter approached the area, they located the clearing Paul had indicated the attack occurred in. On the ground, they could see the bear standing over Christine's motionless body and took careful aim to dispatch the man-killer. The bear slumped over and off of Christine's body, but it was far too late. Christine was dead. A recovery team brought Christine's remains back home for mourning and a memorial of her life. The authorities conducted a necropsy on the bear and found it to be a male about 135 centimeters tall, and it weighed only about 130 pounds. It had no obvious disease and was not protecting a kill it had cached nearby. They had no reason that this bear attack had happened, using the known and typical causes of such events. In the bear's stomach they found some vegetation and bits of Christine's clothing. Mr. Courtney doesn't blame the bear for his wife's death. He states that bears are unpredictable by nature. He also doesn't blame the park for the bear's obviously predatory behavior. He is still tormented by the sights and sounds he experienced while witnessing his wife's death. He rejects the notion that killing more bears would reduce or eliminate extremely rare predatory attacks, like the one that took Christine's life. Authorities' hindsight is anything but useful, but they say the Courtneys should have left their backpacks on to look larger. They should have stood their ground and made a lot of noise. They also note that playing dead in a predatory attack can be a fatal mistake, contrary to the brochure on the park office counter. Authorities say there are about 100 to 150 brown bears in the park, but it isn't clear how they arrive at this number. There are no plans indicating the necessity of reducing bear numbers in the park at this time. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, some questions have come to mind. Do you think the Courtneys were not as afraid of this bear due to his small size? At what point do you think you would have taken defensive action against the bear? What problems may arise if visitors were allowed to carry firearms in the park? Do you think bear spray would have changed the outcome of this attack? I appreciate your comments and will enjoy reading, so post your thoughts below in the comments section and let's talk about it.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the boreal forest of northern Ontario, Canada. The topography consists of flat woodscapes covered in dense forests of a mix of pine and fir trees, maple, poplar, ash, and oak trees. The elevation of this area averages at about 1,000 feet above sea level, and the subarctic climate means that winters are cold and snowy, and summers are hot and rainy. In winter, this area receives an average of 117 inches of snowfall, and seasonal temperatures range from -30 in the winter to nearly 100 in the summer months. Wildlife in the area range from beautiful birds like blue jay to eagles and owls, with white-tailed deer and moose being the primary food source for timber wolves, lynx, fox, and black bears of the area. Notice I said primary food source. This would be an indication that there may be a secondary food source for some of these animals. On May 11, 2013, 30-year-old tech entrepreneur Joe Azagar was just finishing up cooking breakfast at his remote off-grid 8x16 cabin located about 10 miles south of the town of Cochrane. Joe grabbed his plate and headed out to his front porch with his German Shepherd Ace for a meal while basking in the peace of his yard. Joe's brother bred German Shepherds and told Joe that he would need a large protective dog up there, so 2 days prior he brought one up for him. As Joe settled in with his breakfast plate, Ace lay down beside him and stared into the trees. Ace wasn't wound up or upset and seemed to be relaxing as much as Joe. Suddenly there was a thump, and the ground vibrated. Joe looked over to see a massive black bear break from cover very near his cabin and streak toward him and Ace. It may have been part instinct, but Ace was trained to protect, and he met the bear about halfway across the short yard. The two animals growled and thumped in a frenzy of teeth and fur for several minutes as Joe clanged pots and pans together to try to scare the bear away. Joe called a friend of his to tell him what's going on and watched the bear and dog square off. The bear got the best of Ace, and Joe heard his dog howl and bark and watched as the bear killed Ace and dragged him off into the bush. Joe stared in stunned sadness for a few minutes, unsure of what to do now, but he looked up to see the bear returning at full speed. The bear made a beeline for the small window on the back of the cabin. The bear easily shattered the glass in the window and shredded the blinds. It then rolled itself through the window and seemed to grow as he spilled onto the floor just a few feet from Joe. Joe ran through the front door and away from the bear as fast as he could, slamming the door closed behind him. As he ran, he looked over his shoulder, and the bear was already through the door somehow and right on his heels. As Joe fled, the bear ran clear around him and slammed him into the ditch. The 400-pound predator wasted no time and immediately started peeling Joe's scalp from his skull. Joe shrieked in pain and cried out to God not to let him die this way. Just then the bear slowed down for a moment, and that allowed Joe to curl into a ball to protect his neck and head. Since the bear now only had easy access to Joe's shoulder, he started chewing on that. The bear bit into a chunk of flesh near Joe's armpit and pulled, and then did the same thing on his shoulder. He continued to bite and pull and tried to roll Joe over onto his back, but Joe resisted. As the two fought, Joe jammed his thumb into the bear's eye, but the bear didn't even react and continued to bite him. The weight and strength of the bear was so overwhelming that Joe related the attack to being bolted to the ground. The stench of the bear reeked like something dead and rotten. Time seemed to slow down as the bear searched for a weak spot in Joe's defenses to attack. The bear clearly wanted to get at Joe's stomach area, as it continually bit and pulled him in an attempt to flip him. Joe knew that if the bear could get to his belly, it would tear his guts out, so he continued to fight to maintain his defensive position. As the bear continually shifted its attack from Joe's shoulder to his skull, then back to his side, he could see the bear's face covered in blood, and wasn't sure if the blood belonged to Ace or him. The bear returned to Joe's head, and Joe could hear the bear's teeth grating along his skull as it made a sound. Joe could feel the bear trying to get his skull inside of its mouth. At that point, Joe's lost a lot of blood from several bites all over his upper body, and adrenaline and blood loss are starting to wear him down. Just a few minutes before, sisters Denise Didone and Louise Sequin were driving down a bush road near Joe's cabin on a Mother's Day getaway. They were staying with friends at a nearby location and had decided to run to the nearby town of Cochrane to fetch some supplies. Louise glanced over and saw a huge black bear. She reached over, grabbed her sister's leg, and said, "Look, a bear!" The women watched as the bear was standing over something that was obscured to them and was thrashing about. Denise thought that Joe was a trash bag and the bear was ripping into it to eat something inside. Then they saw Joe's leg protruding from underneath the bear. Denise yelled at her sister to hit the horn, and the two women turned onto the road and approached the scene. The bear was scared away by the horn and the approaching vehicle. The sisters yelled at Joe to get into their van, and Joe stumbled to his feet. Joe collapsed back to the ground, and the sisters knew they were too small to help such a large man into their van. The trio cooperated enough to get him inside, and the sisters saw what terrible condition the bear had left Joe in. His scalp was hanging from his head, and his shoulder was bitten and torn up with blood seeping from puncture wounds and gashes all over it. His clothes had been shredded and torn from his body as well. They drove him straight to Lady Minto Hospital for emergency medical care. Doctors sewed up Joe's wounds with 300 stitches after cleaning them. As soon as the morphine kicked in, Joe started to smile, and the sisters knew he'd be just fine. The sisters returned to their campmates and worried about Joe over the next few days. After they could see he was recovering, they began to feel relieved about the events. When people addressed them as heroes, the sisters eschewed the accolades and insisted they didn't fight the bear, but merely pulled up close enough to scare it off, and would have done the same thing for anyone in this predicament. Joe calls them his angels. When asked what he planned to do after he's released from the hospital, Joe stated he would make sure to upgrade the security features at his cabin, just in case any bears came back. He also planned to get some firearms and bear spray. Joe says this will not stop him from enjoying the outdoors. The bear that killed Ace and a few of Joe's chickens, as well as nearly killed Joe, was killed by local authorities. It took several shots, but the bear was eventually tracked down using a helicopter. I could find no sources indicating the condition of the bear, whether it was diseased or of ill health. Joe will have to endure years of physical therapy, and when asked about human perceptions of bear attacks, states that people still think bear attacks don't happen. He urges people to just Google it, and you'll be surprised. Ontario currently has black bear hunting season, though bear numbers are stated to be over 75,000. The Ministry of Natural Resources offer Be Bear Aware courses to hikers and campers. A few questions I'm left with are, was the bear rabid or in a state of poor health? Did the bear attack because Joe's cabin was suddenly introduced to its environment or because it smelled the food? Why didn't it stop once it had the body of Ace to eat? Was this attack a territorial attack?
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. This week's episode takes us to my family cabin in central Idaho, just about 20 miles south of one of the largest wilderness areas in the lower 48, the Frank Church Wilderness Area. Yes, this event happened to me and my family. This area is 1 mile high in elevation and consists of steep, decomposed granite mountains covered in pine, fir, and a mix of willow, alder, buckbrush, as well as various berry bushes. It was the month of April 2009, and Boise County of central Idaho had received several times the amount of typical rainfall. It was almost like you could watch the Payette River set a new high water mark each time you entered on the old wooden bridge. Make no mistake, it was beautiful. Everything was green, and the clouds rolling across the sky dimmed the light just enough you didn't even have to squint to take it all in. My family had a terrible time due to the real estate crash. We lost our business, 4 rental houses, and our primary house as well. We also lost our 2 family cars and just about everything useful to help us recover. In fact, I believe the bankruptcy cutoff mandated we forfeit anything worth more than $500 of liquidated value. All we had was each other. My wife Xandra and I decided to move ourselves and our 2 sons, Ezra and Azariah, to the family cabin to complete construction on the halfway done building. The walls were 7¼ D logs on the first floor, then the upper floor was framed out of attic trusses, creating 2 bedrooms that only had the floors installed, no walls yet. I struck a deal with my dad that if I finished the cabin, he would buy the materials and we could live there until we could get better jobs. Xandra's parents had let us borrow their RV, which we parked up the hill overlooking the cabin, and I would go down and work all day. The morning of April 20th was wet and cold, as I made my way through the buckbrush and down the hill toward the day's labor. As I approached the cabin, I could see a complete disaster. In front of the cabin, we had erected a small tarp shelter to stash our tools under, since we had not built a garage. There were wrappers and tools scattered all over the place. I looked at the bottom of a bookcase I was using as an improvised tool shelf, and the tubes of spray foam sealant all had holes in the bottom of each can. Down below that was a large ball of foam with my drill, my hammer, and a few random tools and items embedded in it. The first thing I thought of was, wow, my friends drove all the way up here just to prank me, but that's not what happened. I started looking around at the other items under the shelter. A large bag of dog food had been laid flat on the ground with a near-perfect X cut through the top of it and had it pulled back. None of it seemed missing. There was a 12-pack of Dr. Pepper soda, which every single can had been punctured and probably consumed if not dumped out on the ground. The 12-pack of Diet Pepsi was nearly untouched. The bag of potatoes was knocked on the ground but not otherwise bothered. The bag of apples that was on top of the bookcase was missing, apples, bag, and all. The 2-gallon bar oil container for my chainsaw was pierced full of holes and completely empty as well. After taking in all this chaos and realizing it had occurred only about 100 yards from where my family and I had just slept, ate breakfast, and played, unnerved me a bit. I decided to clean up and put a stop to this right away. I raked up all of the debris and put it in the burn barrel we burned trash in and moved it about 80 yards down the road. I scooped up the dog food and broadcast the waste down the hill to try to spread out the smell. I moved all the other food into the building and emptied the trash, which was filled with dirty diapers, rotten milk cartons, and paper plates rinsed of the syrup from breakfast pancakes a few days prior. Combine all of that with the record amount of rainfall, and we had inadvertently created a bear bait at our front door. That day I worked hard on the plumbing and electrical wiring, but my mind continued to wonder about the bear. Around lunchtime I decided to knock off and eat with my family. I went outside and noticed that the white 275-gallon IBC tank had a big smear on the side of it. I walked over to it and observed a large bear paw print, perfectly placed, about 4 feet off the ground. It was big. I took out my tape measure and measured it. It was about 6.5 inches across. If you've ever had that feeling that someone is watching you, and you look up and someone is staring at you from across the room, then you will know the feeling I had the rest of the day. I would stop and look over the brushy hillside, but I didn't notice anything strange. I finished the work for the day early and went up to help prepare dinner and get the boys ready for bed. After dinner, around 7 p.m., I couldn't shake that feeling again, and I thought I would pacify my nerves. I told Xandra to wait here with the boys, and I'm going to go look outside. I walked over to the edge of the small hill and looked down toward the cabin. The area was mostly elderberry bushes and buckbrush, but had some big pines and fir trees mixed in. I stared at the open door of the cabin for probably about 10 minutes, just wondering if the bear would be back that night, and second-guessing leaving my .300 Winchester Magnum hunting rifle in the cabin while I ate. Just as I started to feel like it was all fine and well, I heard a loud bonk, and the bear ran down the hill from the cabin into a small clearing. He'd been right in front of me the whole time, and I was practically staring right at him. He'd knocked over the wood splitter and startled himself. Right when I saw him and how close he was to my family, I could feel this sort of anger welling up in me. I started yelling at him to go away and get out of here. He responded by standing on his hind legs and staring at me. Xandra came running out to see what I was yelling at. I told her to wait right there and keep an eye on the bear as I headed down the hill to the cabin to get my rifle. I would start down the hill, and the bear would hear me rustling in the bushes and start coming toward me to investigate. Xandra would yell at me to get back up because the bear was coming toward me, and I would scramble my way back up the hill to get a visual on him again. The bear would then return back to his clearing and stand on his hind legs again to see me as well. This went on about 3 times before I figured he was going to continue to do this, and I went back to yelling at him. As I watched him from my elevated perspective, he walked over to the decomposed granite hill my kids played on with their toy trucks. I watched him as he went from item to item, sniffing where I placed my hands on my shovel, smelling the toy dump truck and the other toys my sons were playing with earlier. I thought to myself, this son of a bitch is indexing my whole family. I watched him slip through the trees hidden by shadows from the spotlight as he walked right inside my cabin. After about 2 hours of this, with 1 hour of that under the spotlight, I finally decided to drive down there and make sure he was gone. The road to the cabin winds about 1 mile around the hill in nearly a circle. As I pulled up, I could see the open cabin door, but wasn't sure where the bear had gone. It was pitch black, and I started to get out of my truck to close the cabin door, but what if the bear was inside? I would be shutting him in, and then he would wreck the place trying to get out. And if I went in there to get my rifle, I might run into him. I decided the bear had won this battle of wits. I retreated back up the hill to my RV, unarmed and irritated that I had been outsmarted. The next day I walked back down the hill to see what had occurred overnight. I walked through the cabin just to make sure he wasn't still in there. I made sure to grab my rifle this time. He was gone, and I resumed work. At lunchtime I told Xandra that I wanted us to sleep in the cabin that night just in case he came back. We made the proper sleeping arrangements and moved in right after dinner time. She slept up on the queen mattress with the boys, and I slept on the floor with my rifle. The rain played a tempo on the metal roof, and the off-grid cabin was devoid of any other noise. No electric buzz of gadgets, refrigerators, or appliances. Just the rhythmic patter of rain and metered drops in puddles from the roof. It wasn't long before we were all sleeping. I have a strange ability to listen while I sleep, and just after midnight I heard a distant bonk. I grabbed my rifle and stood up to investigate. Xandra asked me, "What are you doing?" I said. "The bear's here." I heard him tip over the burn barrel down the road. She was too tired to consider the situation and objected as I crept through the darkness to the window at the other end of the upstairs. The moon was full and lit up the entire area, and the land was thinly veiled by the ground fog that floated just above it. I could see the bear with his head in the burn barrel about 80 yards from me. I pulled open the spring-loaded window and held it open with my left hand while it also grasped the flashlight and stabilized my rifle while I was aiming. The bear pulled his head from the burn barrel, and the full moon highlighted his ears. I aimed right between his ears and pulled the trigger. This awkward shooting position ended with me gashing my nose open with a scope ring on the back of the gun and completely losing sight of the bear after I shot. I wiped the blood from my nose as I flashed the light around the bush, looking for eyeshine. I stayed there and looked for several minutes, and I couldn't find him, nor had I heard him run off through the bushes. If I hit him, I knew where he would be in the morning. I went back to bed. Not more than an hour later, I hear something big being dragged across the plywood floor below us. The bear was inside the cabin. I jumped up and grabbed my gun and assumed the flashlight holding the rifle position from earlier and cleared the cabin in the dark. Each room I cleared, I concluded he had to be in the next room, but he wasn't. Perplexed, I went back upstairs and tried to go back to sleep. After about 30 more minutes, I could hear a noise like a dog scratching on the metal door. I grabbed my rifle and headed back to the second-floor window I shot from earlier and flashed the flashlight around. Nothing. I just heard him scratching on that door like a dog who wanted to be let in. I again surveyed the area for eyeshine, but nothing. As soon as I laid down, I began drifting off to sleep again, but was awakened again by a noise from him moving something around outside this time. By this point, I was too tired and just banged on the framing of the building and yelled at him. I could hear him run off. This cycle repeated itself every 30 minutes or so until about 5:30 a.m. I decided to go downstairs and figure out what the big object I heard moving across the floor was. When you build a log cabin, an easy way to keep your building secure while marking out your windows is to skip every other log row where your windows are going to be. It leaves a series of parallel openings in your wall that permits light and air to come in, but nothing very big. By looking at the bear tracks outside and the scratches on the logs, I could see that the bear had reached into the window and pulled down a coat we had hanging on a nail. He knocked down a can of peanut butter and accidentally snagged a small wheeled office chair. That was the noise I heard in the night. For the next few days, I would work and look around, keeping a careful eye on my sons playing in the granite face. All the while, I had this eerie feeling that we were being watched, even though I had no proof. After getting a few good looks at this bear, I was left with the impression that he was what I called a dork bear. He was probably kicked out of the den by his mom and chased out of the better bear claims by more mature males. So he decided our unintentional bear bait was a great invitation to stake out a new territorial claim. I estimated he weighed about 250 pounds, but Xandra said he was much larger than I am when I stood in the same place she saw him. I weigh about 350 pounds, so that would make him 500 pounds. I'm pretty sure she was just excited, and it made him seem larger. I spoke with my neighbor Dick, the man who owns the chalet up the hill. He said the bear had torn off his wellhead cover. Otto from down the hill said that the bear had cut open his screen porch to eat the cat's food. It was bear season, but I decided to call the Idaho Fish and Game to see if they could trap him and move him somewhere that he could be a bear instead of a pet. It took a few days, and the game warden showed up towing a huge culvert trap. He parked it on my driveway, and he baited it with a small amount of fish and blood and set the spring-loaded door, warning me to keep my kids away from it because it could cut off an arm. Xandra had had enough of the Idaho woods and begged some of our friends in Boise to let us stay with them until we found an apartment. That little dork bear outsmarted that game warden for the rest of the summer, and he never did catch him. We found out later that the bear was sleeping about 100 yards from my cabin under my neighbor's deck. I was told by the same neighbor that the bear was shot by some hunters a few years later, a bit further up the valley.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the stormy and challenging environs of Kodiak Island, just off of Alaska's central coast. There is a ridge of mountains that divides Kodiak Island, creating remote and isolating places for giant bears to grow without interference from people. The city of Kodiak is located on the far eastern end of the island and has some modern amenities there. It is a growing town and a difficult place to grow. About 10 miles southwest of town is a rural development along Bell's Flats Road near Woman's Bay. This small collection of houses are set out on a series of acreages, granting neighbors privacy and seclusion. Meanwhile, just outside all of their front doors, Kodiak bears fish, hunt, browse, and carry on with their normal lives among the alder bushes that cover this area. Chris Heilman was an officer on the Coast Guard's tactical law enforcement team while serving in Miami, Florida. While visiting Kodiak in 2013, he promised himself that he would retire here, and shortly thereafter fulfilled that promise. It is the smallest of small towns, featuring one restaurant and one little store. It is the kind of place where, when you eat out, you certainly can't afford to complain if you don't like the food or service. Heilman states that living in Alaska, you have to get used to bears. You don't just walk blindly toward your vehicle when heading to work in the morning. Here, you open the door and look around before departing. This is the kind of environment that living close to bears, particularly giant bears, fosters in residents' minds. Walking around a corner and surprising a bear is a resident's greatest worry. Heilman says that if you put a brisket in the smoker and wheel it into your garage, the giant bears on Kodiak Island will rip your entire garage door off to get at it. During a stormy night on September 27, 2022, Aaron Olson had begun to doze off from a hard day's work. He and his family lived 5 doors down from Chris Heilman's house on Bell's Flat Road. He typically went to bed around midnight, but by 10 was nodding off on the couch. Maribel, his pregnant wife, and 5 of his 6 kids were already asleep in their beds. His typical routine, locking all the doors and turning on the porch lights before heading up to bed, but this time he was too groggy. He stumbled his way upstairs and collapsed in his bed. As Aaron slumbered, the winds whipped up and roared outside. The pounding rain created a background of white noise that would hide nearly any unusual sounds. The moon wasn't shining, and the cloud cover limited what light it showed. It was a very typical fall night on the windswept island. As Aaron slept, around 11 p.m., the family dog, Harley, let out a very distinct bark that is long and intense. It is a bark that Aaron knows well, as it is Harley's way of telling him there is a bear nearby. Aaron knew better than to ignore this particular bark from Harley. He leapt to his feet and grabbed his home defense pistol. It was a Taurus Judge, which is a revolver which allows the user to load either 410 shotgun ammo or 45 revolver pistol ammunition in it. It was designed to be used against varmints, but has the versatility to be used for home defense as well, although neither would be great to use against a giant Kodiak bear. Aaron thought that the bear was on his porch, so with his pistol in hand stealthily crept through his house in his underwear toward the porch area. Harley was still bellowing his bear alarm as Aaron approached the door of the porch. It was so dark outside that he couldn't see anything, and he wasn't about to open the door to check. As he considered his options, he could hear Maribel say, "Baby, there is a bear," from their bedroom. As he turned to look at the bedroom door he had just walked through, his vision was filled with one of the most massive brown bears he had ever seen. The bear was smelling the air coming from Aaron's bedroom and staring down Maribel. To get to where the bear was, he would have had to walk in through the front door, through the living room and kitchen, walk right past the fried chicken leftovers on the counter, and stop in front of the washing machine. As it entered, it had somehow bumped the front door closed behind it, preventing it from departing. This bear had crossed too many lines for Aaron to do anything but shoot it. He knew he had to take a good shot on the bear and couldn't afford to miss with so many of his family members in the house. 2 of his children were sleeping just around the corner from where the bear was now standing, making Aaron's decision complicated, to say the least. As Aaron began to squeeze the trigger, he aimed at the bear's shoulder but couldn't see its head. This bear was out of scale in the hallway of Aaron's family home, but somehow managed to turn around and try to get out the same way it came in. It headed back toward the front door, with Aaron and his pistol right behind it. Like some scene out of a Western movie, Aaron followed the bear while firing his pistol at it. He not only assailed the bear with bullets, but with cuss words, and he yelled at it to get out of his house. He states he was not afraid at this point, just extremely angry. The giant bear had fled back along its initial path and had entered the Arctic entry to the home. This is basically a room separated from the outside entrance to give a buffer from outside temperatures entering the home. Most families put coats, shoes, or other storage goods there. The bear was stuck in a room measuring 8 feet by 8 feet, which either dimension was smaller than the bear on all fours. Aaron could hear the bear trying to turn around in the entryway, knocking items from the wall and trying to escape. 3 of the 4 bullets fired by Aaron's judge had hit the bear, but were not fatal. The gun simply isn't powerful enough to bring a giant brown bear down quickly. Aaron held back on firing the 1 remaining round in his pistol. He knew these giant bears could be unpredictable, especially when trapped and injured. He could hear the bear loudly breathing as it searched for an escape route. The bear was so upset at being trapped in Aaron's home, it had purged its bowels, which is a common sign of distress in bears, and animals in particular. 2 of Aaron's girls were awake but still in their beds. They could hear their father yelling at them to stay in their bedroom in the heavy breathing of the trapped bear. It was apparent to Aaron that the bear was scared, but that doesn't mean it wouldn't react violently to any assistance he offered to it to flee. Meanwhile, Maribel had called 911 to get some armed backup for Aaron. Their son Jamie called his grandpa, whose home was only 200 yards away. Jamie's older brother was staying with Grandpa, and they showed up to pull the other 5 Olsen kids through the bedroom windows to the safety of Grandpa's house. As Aaron kept an eye on the massive bear and listened to it thrashing about, he could feel himself start to fade out a bit. He was still unsure if everyone was safely out of the home, and the officer was still about 15 minutes away. Back in the Heilman home, the phone rang. Chris's wife had picked it up and had listened as a concerned neighbor relayed the predicament of the Olsen family nearby. It turned out that one of Chris's friends was responding to the 911 call and decided to request his help. His wife had called Chris's wife because she didn't want her husband to respond alone, so Chris was woken up to assist. Chris had his Remington 870 tactical shotgun nearby and filled his pockets with Winchester XP 1-ounce copper sabot slugs. These slugs have about 2,489 foot-pounds of energy when they leave the muzzle, which is enough to bring down any animal in North America. As Chris approached the Olsens' front door, he could see the bear through the window. Its head was moving up and down as if it was licking itself, perhaps nursing its wounds from Aaron's pistol. Chris was trained to breach as part of his Coast Guard police training and would now be putting it to good use. His main concern was if his bullet might travel into the home and possibly injure one of the family members. Chris had decided that he could shoot the bear in the head once its head dipped down below the window section of the door. He stood about 10 feet from the door and watched as the bear's massive head bobbed up and down. At what he thought would be the perfect time, Chris squeezed the trigger, sending one of the slugs through the door. The Olsen house shuddered as the slug ripped through the door. The well-timed and placed slug hit the bear beneath its jaw and went straight through its brain. It instantly killed the bear. Chris and his friend crept up and shined the flashlight through the Olsen's door to examine the bear. It was motionless, but they knew they were not about to walk up on it any time soon. The alternative was to go around and enter the back door, but they would then be in the same room with the injured bear. It was clearly better to stay in the wind and rain and observe the bear for any sign of life. Now some time had elapsed and the bear was clearly dead. The men entered the Olsen home. The place reeked of bear scat and stench. As the bear had wandered the hallways, it had rubbed blood, mud, and feces all over any surface it touched. The bear scat had been stomped into the carpet and covered nearly every bit of the room. The 4 men tried to move the bear and did manage to pull it back away from the door. Realizing the bear was simply too massive to move from the house, they got creative. They contacted a tow truck service who used the cable winch on the truck to drag the bear from the house. These pictures will not pass the YouTube guidelines, so I have uploaded pictures of this gigantic bear and the scene from the house to my Patreon account, linked below, but I do warn you, some viewers may find them offensive or troubling. The tow truck driver winched the bear carcass all the way up onto the bed and drove it over to the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. In Alaska, when a bear destroys property or threatens livelihood or life whenever it is killed, it belongs to the state. That includes the hide, claws, teeth, and meat. The person who kills the bear is required by law to surrender its complete carcass. Once the Fish and Game officers got a chance to look the bear's carcass over, they determined that the bear weighed in at 988 pounds. To assess the trophy qualifications for bears, judges use a measurement of the bear's skull. This bear's skull measured 27 inches, which was nearly record book-sized. Being grateful that the Olson family was safe, the cleanup of the bear's blood, feces, and mud seemed to be a very minor penalty compared to what could have happened. Aaron stated that the bear seemed sort of graceful while in the home, given he didn't even knock a picture off the wall. Apparently the adrenaline involved in this bear encounter did something to Aaron, as he now plans to go bear hunting and get a bearskin rug. He has purchased a 12-gauge Benelli M4 shotgun and registered as a bear hunter. He says he doesn't want to hunt bears in his living room ever again, especially since he had to surrender the hide. Now he plans to adorn his living room with a bear hide taken from the woods. It is estimated that there are 3,500 brown bears living on Kodiak Island. There are about 180 brown bears harvested on Kodiak Island each year. Over the past 75 years, there has been only one fatal bear attack on Kodiak Island. After reviewing the details of this incident, I am left with a few questions for you. Do you think that the bear would have left on its own if it hadn't bumped the front door shut on itself? Why do you think there are so few human fatalities from bear attacks on Kodiak Island? Did you look at the pictures of the massive bear on Patreon? How do you think you could escape such a creature? I look forward to reading your responses, so please post them in the comments section below and let's talk about it.
Today's episode takes us to the scenic Taylor County in northern Wisconsin, to the town of Medford. With only 20,633 people in all of Taylor County and 4,285 people in Medford, this area is vintage, small-town America. To the south of the town, farmland sprawls and produces snap peas, potatoes, carrots, and sweet corn. On the plentiful orchards around the area, the top products are cherries, apples, nuts, and cranberries. The state of Wisconsin is one of the top states for producing dairy products and boasts over 600 different cheeses. Just about 5 miles north of Medford, the surrounding area is host to the Mondo Hardwood State Natural Area, a sort of state park set apart for the preservation of natural ecologies. To the west of that is the Kidrick State Swamp Natural Area, a mix of swampy woods, ponds, lakes, and streams. A diverse set of wildlife species call this area home and include white-tailed deer, coyotes, foxes, cougar, elk, and even wolves. This area is just about as wild as it gets. Just north of Medford, a family is settling in for the night. To protect the anonymity of the family, we will be calling the couple Dave and Deborah. The children were put to bed for the evening, and Dave and Deborah were beginning to unwind from the day. They enjoyed watching the birds eat from their bird feeder in the backyard, but this evening they could hear something unusual back there. As they peered into the darkness, they flipped the back porch light on and see the eyeshine of 4 eyes glowing back at them. It takes their eyes a moment to adapt to the darkness, but within a few seconds they can make out the shape of a large bear and a small bear. They are looking at a sow black bear and her cub raiding their bird feeder. Dave and Deborah aren't too concerned at the sight, but they paid good money for those bird feeders and didn't want them damaged. Dave begins to yell through the open window at the bears. He tells them to go away and get out of here. As soon as he begins yelling, the sow's head quickly turns toward him. His voice alarms her as she was unaware of any human presence. Her cub immediately runs for the bushes nearby, and the sow charges toward Dave's voice coming from the window. It's hard to make out what's going on as he looks through the window in the darkness, but Dave thinks he can make out the shape of a bear moving quickly toward him, and he can hear the grunting and growling as she comes. Suddenly he sees the dark figure emerge into the window frame from which he's yelling. Before he could even process what's going on, the bear is coming through the window after him. Dave is completely terrified as the large bear is now inside of his home and biting and clawing at him. Dave is yelling and trying to fight back when Deborah begins yelling and trying to run the bear off and back out of their house. Dave grabs a kitchen knife and tries to stab the bear in a vital area. He gets in a few good jabs, but the bear continues her attack and is now biting and clawing at Deborah. Dave is now becoming more desperate as he runs through the house to get his gun. As he grabs it and runs back toward the bear, which is now entering the hallway leading to their children's bedroom, Dave takes careful aim and dispatches the Bruin before it can get any further down the hallway. Dave and Deborah have numerous bites and claw marks on their bodies and call authorities to the scene for assistance. Both of them fought valiantly and suffered moderate injuries, which were treated at the hospital. The exact number of bites on their bodies was not released, but is reported to be several.
The Taylor County Sheriff's Office responds to the call for help and documents the occurrence. The Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources takes possession of the bear's carcass for analysis. Bear attacks in Wisconsin are rare, but a home invasion from a black bear is nearly non-existent. In 1989, Wisconsin was reported to have 9,000 black bears, but today that number exceeds 24,000 black bears. As forest and habitat are developed, that increases pressure on the bears, especially sows with cubs, to find resources for survival. The state of Wisconsin does have a bear hunting season, which is a little over a month long and runs from mid-September to mid-October most years. Most hunting zones have a quota system to help stabilize populations, but as bears are pushed into areas occupied by people and out of ideal habitat through competition, bear populations will have to be decreased to avoid further
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes place in the Russian Far East, to a place we have visited before, a primitive and rugged peninsula called Kamchatka, where the geological activity rivals sites from our very own Yellowstone National Park. There are geysers and beautiful mineral water pools here, as this region is part of the Ring of Fire volcanically active area surrounding the Pacific Ocean. As you can see by the satellite view of this area, it is very pristine with forests and beautiful mountains, and very few cities or towns. The elevation of this area is very low at under 1,000 feet in elevation, with the exception of mountains that rise to about 2,500 feet in elevation at their highest. The streams of this area are responsible for just over 25% of the world's salmon population. Dahurian larch and Asian white birch are the predominant trees in this area, with higher elevations giving way to Erman's birch and Mongolian poplar. The lower canopy is crowded with Manchurian alder and Sachalin willow. The beauty of alpine flowers, pink lady slippers, and Arctic daisy flowers belie the dangerous environment surrounding our episode today. In midsummer 2008, the area around the mines at Koryak Geologia mine near Kailino, who sought platinum, were experiencing an oppressively hot summer. When fresh waters are even a few degrees warmer than normal, it tends to hold fewer nutrients as well as less oxygen. It can lead to environmental stresses on migrating salmon populations. It can also lead to lower quality berries and berry yields. These two food sources are very important for brown bears and are the leading factors around our event today. The workers at the mines had noticed a spike in bear sightings around the mines. It isn't too unusual. After all, bears live everywhere around here, but these bears seem desperate and much more dangerous than normal. As the weeks passed, concerns grew into fear, as the bears began to gather in larger groups than anyone believed that they would. The locals had noticed that there were about 30 giant bears that seemed drawn to congregate around the tiny town. The bears that were appearing around town were huge, abnormally large to be so close to civilization. Typically at this time of year, these giant bears would be claiming and defending prime salmon fishing spots along the rivers. But now 1,500-pound brown bears were gathering near the edges of the village in numbers. It wasn't uncommon to see smaller brown bears near town, as the scent of garbage and food lured them in, due to the fact that they couldn't compete with the giant bears claiming prime salmon fishing locations. But now the biggest bears in the area were gathering there. A local pastime which aggravated the circumstance was fish poaching. Because of the poverty-stricken conditions of the local economy, some locals resorted to poaching salmon from the streams, and thereby reducing available fish for the bears. They also sometimes poached the bears as well. The remnants and waste from the poached salmon were frequently discarded in the city, in garbage cans, which are usually near the houses. The scent of their normal food source and the desperation of their conditions were too tempting for the bears, as they were drawn right into town by them. The security guards of the mine were particularly vulnerable to the approach of the bears, as they are posted near mine entrances and only have a small booth for protection. Given their bathrooms were primitive outhouses, each time they felt the call of nature, they would have to risk their lives just to relieve themselves. The increase in bear activity had put everyone on edge, and they were all wary whenever one showed up. As more and more large bears began to filter closer and closer to town, it was only a matter of time before something dramatic occurred. As two of the guards at the mine were tending to their duties, they were unaware of a pack of desperate and starving bears heading in their direction. It isn't exactly clear how the bears got to the men, but a patrol around the mine found their bodies. They were mauled to death, but were uneaten, though gnawed on.
The pictures of these men's bodies are horrible, and I cannot post them here, but they are available on my Patreon channel, linked below. But I warn you, they are extremely graphic. You will also find photos of some of the giant dead bears there. After the guards were attacked and killed, the 400 geologists and miners were concerned for their safety. Each time they ventured outside, they had to watch for desperate bears sneaking up on them, or acting aggressively toward them. The bears were seen running through town and even injuring people. The situation became untenable, and they eventually refused to travel to work at the grounds of the mine. When local authorities commissioned sharpshooters to fly in by helicopter to kill and reduce the number of bears in the area, the weather degraded and fog set in, preventing them from doing so. Even so, eventually they did cull several of the most aggressive bears, creating the most dangerous situations. Elders of the village say that once the bears recognize people as a food source, they must be killed. The local attitude toward the plight of the bears is overall negative, especially in the mining community. Experts say there are somewhere between 12,000 and 16,000 brown bears on the Kamchatka Peninsula. They also report that salmonfish poachers have wiped out entire species using nets on rivers to catch them. Officials cite that salmon poachers illegally harvest 100,000 tons of salmon each year, and this affects not only salmon populations, but the health of bear populations as well. In 2008, hunters reportedly harvested 300 brown bears, but estimates climb to 600 bears that have been poached. For the meanwhile, local officials are left with the only short-term solution, which is to kill the bears. But is this a long-term solution? After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I have a few questions for you. Do you think the guards were killed in predatory or territorial attacks? How do you think Russia should resolve the economic crisis, creating the need for locals to poach fish and animals? Is local bear population reduction a viable solution, or what approach is better? I look forward to reading your comments, so post them below and let's talk about it. Today's episode takes us to a bleak and nearly inhospitable land in northern Siberia, Russia. The village of Keta is on the Taimyr Peninsula, which extends into the Arctic Ocean. The temperatures here range from an average low of -3 degrees Fahrenheit in the winter to an average high temperature in July of 77 degrees Fahrenheit. In winter, there is an average of only 2 hours of daylight, and the elevation is around 1,000 feet above sea level. The land here is tundra, that is sparse and open for the most part. There are small bushes of willow big enough to limit visibility in the lower areas with occasional stands of stunted trees. The predominant animals here are caribou, moose, elk, wild boar, and Siberian musk deer. The common predators are brown bears, wolves, Arctic and red fox, as well as Eurasian lynx. It is in this bleak yet wild setting that our episode takes place. When you think of the Arctic, you probably think of the polar bear as being the predominant predator that could pose a danger, but there is more to the issue than meets the eye. Brown bears are actually very common in the land areas of the Arctic. There is a strange phenomenon that exists between these two bears that makes interbreeding rare and difficult. It ties back into the animal's survival strategy. The polar bear hunts and gets fatter during the winter time, when ice packs form and cover up large spans of open water, leaving only breathing holes for seals and whales to breathe through. This makes for an abundance of food for the polar bears during the winter months, who simply hunt over the breathing holes in the ice. Brown bears, in contrast, fatten up on sedge grasses, the eggs of birds and calves of caribou, plus winter-killed caracasses in the spring. They continue to grow larger while feeding on berries in the brief berry seasons. This means that brown bear and polar bear active seasons, and consequently their breeding seasons are offset from each other. Given both animals prefer different habitats, with polar bears preferring to hunt along the ice edge and brown bears hunting more inland, they don't have a great chance of meeting up for breeding. That is how two different types of bear exist on the same territory, but do not often interbreed. As you can see in the Arctic, there is a bear species that can threaten human safety no matter what season it is. September is a very crucial month for brown bears, but then again, every month of the feeding season is. On September 23rd, a 6-year-old boy, whom we will call Ivan, and his twin sister, whom we will call Olga, were playing with other children from their village on a helicopter pad. The pad served as a way outside services, and light-duty goods could be brought into the villagers when other means were not possible. The children were unaware that this year had been difficult for local brown bears, and a huge and hungry one was watching them from the bushes nearby. It wasn't clear if the bear had been brought in by the smells emanating from the city garbage cans, the sounds of the children, or if it was just wandering by and stumbled upon them. Whatever the reason was, it was disastrous for Ivan, his sister, and their village. As the kids ran around and chased each other, the brown bear honed in on Ivan. Perhaps he was the closest one, but for some strange reason Ivan drew the bear's attention. It burst from the nearby bushes and quickly slammed the boy into the ground and began biting and clawing at him. It began dragging him into the bushes as he kicked and screamed for help. Olga had seen the attack, and she and the other children fled as fast as they could, as Ivan futilely struggled against the hungry bear's intentions to kill him and feed on him. It wasn't but a few seconds before Ivan was still and lifeless. Olga ran all the way back to her village, screaming in terror, and quickly alerted adults in the village. An armed response team was rapidly rounded up and began searching for the bear. They scoured the bushes near the area for several hours before finally locating it a short distance away. They fired their rifles, and the upset Ursus lay as still as the snow around him. There is no report I could find in my research on the condition of the bear, but it is logical to say that most brown bears, even hungry ones, do not frequently hunt people. It is fair to assume that it was driven by the need to fatten up to survive winter, but we have no information regarding its weight, age, nor condition. But pictures of the dead bear are posted on my Patreon account, linked below, and they show that the bear appeared to be in good shape. The Russian version of the FBI, called the Russian Investigative Committee, investigated the incident, and it appeared to be a clear-cut case of a predatory attack on a human being with the intent to feed upon them. This is nothing new to people living in remote regions of Russia. One commenter on one of the articles I found in my research stated that they were taught to fire high-powered hunting rifles as children, because the bears frequently came into town and might threaten them or others. Other commenters indicated that as children they would find bear tracks in their boot tracks while walking home from school. One thing is certain, the closer we live to prime bear habitat, the more likely dangerous and even deadly runs-in with them will be. They survive in an economy, not based on money but on calories, and each time they spend energy, they are calculating the risks versus the rewards, just like shrewd businessmen with sharp teeth and claws. Knowing this, we must recognize that the most vulnerable targets will be seen as the easiest meal to them. To deny this possibility and reality is pure fantasy, and one that will cost people their lives and the bears as well.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks.
Today's episode takes us to the Russian Far East. Yes, once again. The rail town of Tinda is known as the capital of Siberia's other great railway, the Baikal-Amur Main Line. It is an important area for transportation of people and goods alike to the remote area. The area around the town is rugged and primitive. The forests here are dense and nearly uninterrupted for miles and miles. The Siberian larch, laurel leaf poplar, and the Scots pine are among the tallest trees here, and kites and kestrels hunt the chi and tufted hairgrasses. The world's most dangerous array of predators are here, with Siberian tigers, massive brown bears, wolves, and Amur leopards. In fact, this area is one of the last bastions of survival for the Siberian tiger and the Amur leopard. A few of the common animals here are mountain sheep, antelope, reindeer, and moose. On May 11th, 2015, 54-year-old mother of three, Natalia Pasternak, and her 82-year-old friend, Valentina Gorodetskaya, had spent the day gathering birch sap. Natalia was a postal worker presently, but in her previous career had enjoyed being a baker in the town of Tinda. The sap of the birch tree is used to augment recipes, especially drinks. One very profitable use of birch sap is to use it to make birch syrup, sort of like maple syrup. It can be poured over meat or bread to make pancakes or waffles and is considered a delicacy by some people. It is very expensive in the markets, so it was a good way to make money selling it, or use it for the ladies' personal consumption. They had gathered what they would consider a good day's haul and had enjoyed their time in their favorite spot to harvest it. They had come here together for years, since Natalia's adult kids were little. They had always had a peaceful time surrounded by nature, and today was no different, but their lives were about to change forever. As the women prepared their things for departure, Natalia called her daughter Ekaterina on her cell phone. She told her that they were all done and would soon be on their way back home. Suddenly, Natalia's dog, Gerda, sat up and glared a short distance away. She let out an alarmed bark, then another, then a series of long, howling barks. Natalia had never heard Gerda bark like that before and knew it must be something important. When she glanced up from Gerda, her vision was filled with a brown blur streaking toward her. She instinctively knew it was a bear and turned and ran. She had covered about 40 yards before realizing she had left Valentina all by herself. Valentina couldn't hear very well and couldn't run, so Natalia turned around and looked back toward her friend. She knew Valentina stood no chance of escaping the bear by herself, especially if she hadn't heard Gerda's barks or otherwise been alerted to the presence of the bear. It might just walk right up behind her and kill her unaware. Natalia glanced over toward the bear. Gerda was keeping it at bay several yards away. The bear was vexed by Gerda and wasn't yet focusing on Natalia nor Valentina. Natalia couldn't help but start yelling for Valentina to warn her about the bear. As she yelled, Gerda thought Natalia wanted her to come to her and began running in her direction. The bear, seeing Gerda running, gave chase, and both of the animals were now heading directly for Natalia. With the bear following Gerda, the two were quickly by Natalia's side. The bear seemed confused on who it should attack, the woman or the dog. Natalia froze in fear, but the bear lunged at her. It bit her first on her legs and began pulling at them, trying to force her to the ground. The only thoughts running through Natalia's mind at this point was that this was how she was going to die. She thought nobody would save them. The bear was tearing at the flesh on her legs, and it caused excruciating pain. Natalia knew she would have to fight back or she would be eaten alive. She desperately grabbed the drill and remembered thinking that if she hit the bear, it would enrage it. The bear would then surely kill her quickly. She thought a rapid death would be better than burdening her children, who would have to take care of her if she were disabled. The bear then backed off a few feet, then rose to its hind legs for a moment. It then went back to all four legs and charged her, clamping its jaws onto her legs. The force of the impact knocked her onto her back. In desperation, Natalia tried to poke the bear in the eye with the drill, but it quickly bit through her arm, paralyzing it and making it useless. The bear then focused its attack on her neck. Natalia began yelling out for God to help her as the bear bit and clawed her. As the bear mauled her, she remembered she had not been to confession and would die before repenting from her sins. Right then, Valentina showed up with a big stick, and she began beating the bear with her fists and praying along with her friend. The bear ended her pugilistic prayer assault with a quick swat to her back, which sent her toppling to the ground. Valentina recognized that she would not be able to save her friend, and as quickly as she could, she fled to find help for Natalia. After swatting Valentina, the bear turned back to Natalia. It bit onto her leg and began dragging her deeper into the forest. As she was dragged along the ground, Natalia desperately grabbed at bushes and branches with her working arm to stop the bear from taking her away. After dragging her a short distance, the bear began to rake up leaves and twigs and paw them over Natalia. She silently wondered to herself if the bear was going to signal other bears to come eat her. As Natalia lay still underneath the dirt and leaves, she noticed it was quiet around her. She wondered if the bear had begun to search for Valentina to kill and bury her too. The bear was walking around and had left Natalia for dead, for food later. Natalia was still conscious and was relieved that the attack had stopped. After a little over an hour, the bear returned to her. It began to lick the congealed blood from her neck. It then began to eat her legs while she was still alive. The pain seared through her body with each mouthful of her flesh the bear chewed from her body. When she reached her working arm over to cover her legs, the bear bit through that arm too. Just after the bear crushed her good arm, she heard rifle shots ring out. The bear disappeared from her view, and she could hear footsteps approaching her. 2 hunters had discovered her and had saved her life. Still terrified, Natalia meekly asked if the bear was dead. The hunters responded affirmatively and helped dig her out from the cache. First responders quickly arrived at the scene of Natalia's attack and were surprised to see she was still alive. The injuries she sustained would have killed anyone, but she had never lost consciousness. They loaded her onto a wheeled stretcher and carefully moved her out of the forest and to the hospital. The medical professionals rushed her into the operating room and pulled the sheet covering her body off. She remembers hearing them comment on how she was bitten and clawed all over her entire body. Natalia was shaking from the shock of the attack, but she was alive. The question was, for how long? She recalled that she was covered with blood, leaves, and mud. They immediately administered sedative drugs, and she faded into unconsciousness as her pain disappeared. The surgeons feverishly worked to suture her wounds and stanch her bleeding, stating that her initial prognosis was bleak. Her injuries were extensive and severe. Natalia was missing scalp and neck tissues, as well as deep bites and gashes on her groin, arms, and legs. Her ear was damaged as well, but she was determined that she would recover from this attack. Her daughter Ekaterina would wheel her outside to enjoy the sunlight during her visits. Due to the mud in her wounds, Natalia had a flare-up of sepsis, but the doctors immediately treated it with antibiotics. Natalia also fought a septic pneumonia while hospitalized from the sand and dust that had infiltrated her lungs and bronchial tubes during the attack. She continually dealt with recovering the ability to move her arms and had decided to wear a wig if she couldn't afford plastic surgery to repair her scalp. Ekaterina was supposed to go with the other two women to gather the birch sap. Natalia shudders at the thought of her daughter being attacked as well. Ekaterina was enrolled in a program to be an obstetrician and only beginning her adult life at 20 years of age. The hunter who shot the bear, Sergei Ivanov, informed Natalia that the bear was a 4-year-old female and only about 5 feet 7 inches in height. The sow weighed about 220 pounds, which is a very low weight for a brown bear. This bear had most likely recently emerged from hibernation and was very hungry. Sergei explained that he was just leaving work when the police called him. They told him that a bear had attacked people, and he grabbed his rifle and hurried to help. Once he and his partner arrived, they found Valentina as she escaped from the attack. She was so shocked she couldn't speak and suffered from minor injuries. The two hunters had walked only about 300 yards when Sergei's partner yelled that he had found a bear. The bear immediately charged the hunters and was quickly dispatched by 4 shots from Sergei's rifle. He made sure to end its terror with a coup de grace fired to the head of the sow. It had been laying down, guarding Natalia. She was found only 6 yards from where the bear fell. In prior weeks, bears had been reported encroaching on city boundaries. One bear was shot a week earlier while walking through a residential area. Another bear had been seen digging up corpses in the graveyard. The local area was apparently not able to provide enough food for bears in order for them to go into town like that. There are reportedly 7,000 brown bears in the Amur region. Since 1997, 9 people have been killed by bears in the Tinda district alone. Natalia made significant and rapid progress in her recovery, surprising the doctors. They reported that she was able to walk within a few weeks after the attack. She worked on recovering her strength, and her mental recovery will likely continue for the rest of her life. Natalia commented that the important thing was that she is alive. She said she was grateful to the doctors and hunters for saving her life. As for Goethe, she came out of the fight with the bear unscathed and eagerly waited for Natalia to return home. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I have a few questions for you. Do you think this attack was territorial or predatory? How do you think a firearm would have changed the outcome of this attack? Do you think bear spray would have prevented this attack? Do you think Natalia should have turned around to help Valentina, or should she have kept running to get help? I will enjoy reading your comments, so please post them below and let's talk about it.
Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider clicking on the like button and clicking on the bell icon. We'll help you know when we post our new episodes. Posting our video links to your social media profiles furthers awareness, and it's fun. We slashed our prices in our merch store, linked below, so check out the bargains there while you shop. As a member of our human community, remember to adventure bravely and be careful out there, especially in bear country.